I was standing at the edge of my driveway a little after 7 in the morning when the tow truck turned the corner and slowed to a crawl in front of my house. No warning, no note on the door. Just flashing amber lights and a man climbing down with a clipboard, already wearing the kind of expression that says he's not here to listen. He glanced at my car, didn't even look at me, and said, "HOA says this vehicle is parked on common property. We're here to remove it." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it sounded so absurd. I assumed there had to be a mistake. That strip of concrete had been my driveway since the day I moved in. I paid for the repairs. I shoveled it every winter. My kids learned how to ride their bikes on it, wobbling back and forth while I stood right where that tow truck was parked now. And suddenly, out of nowhere, the HOA was claiming it didn't belong to me. I was standing there, in pajama pants, trying to explain basic reality to a tow driver who clearly didn't care, when my phone buzzed. An email. Subject line: Final notice. Unauthorized use of HOA property. That's when it hit me. This wasn't an error. This was intentional. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I moved into Willow Ridge Estates about 5 years earlier, just outside a small town called Clearbrook, Missouri. It was the kind of place people described as quiet, and actually meant it. Tree-lined streets, wide sidewalks, porches that still got used. Neighbors waved when they walked their dogs. Packages sat on doorsteps all afternoon without disappearing. It felt safe in a way that's hard to explain, unless you've lived somewhere that genuinely lets you exhale. The HOA existed, technically, but for the first few years it barely touched my life. They sent out a monthly newsletter about trash pickup schedules, reminders about holiday decorations, and the occasional note about lawn height during the summer. Nothing aggressive, nothing personal. I paid my dues on time, followed the basic rules, and never heard from them directly. Honestly, I barely thought about them at all. That changed the year the board got new leadership. Her name was Marjorie Collins. She introduced herself at the annual HOA meeting with a tight, practiced smile and a binder so thick it looked more like a prop than something anyone actually used. She spoke slowly and deliberately, like she was used to people listening without interrupting. She talked about restoring order, cleaning up years of lax enforcement, and protecting community assets. At the time, it sounded like boring HOA talk. I remember sitting there thinking she was just another volunteer with too much free time. I didn't realize she saw the neighborhood as something she needed to take control of. About a month later, I received my first notice. It wasn't a fine. It wasn't even addressed like a warning. It was labeled as a clarification. The letter explained that the HOA was conducting a review of common use areas and that some homeowners might be mistaken about where their property lines actually were. It encouraged residents to cooperate fully, while the board ensured compliance. I skimmed it, shrugged, and tossed it on the counter. It didn't mention my house specifically, and I had no reason to think it applied to me. A week later, another email arrived. This one was direct. According to the HOA, my driveway partially encroached on HOA-owned access space. They claimed I was utilizing community property for private parking. I stared at the screen for a long time, genuinely confused. That driveway had been part of my lot since the day I bought the house. It was clearly shown on the paperwork I signed at closing. There was nothing shared about it, nothing ambiguous. I replied calmly. I attached copies of my closing documents. I highlighted the section that clearly labeled the driveway as belonging to my property. I even added a friendly line at the end, assuming this was just a clerical mistake that would be cleared up quickly. The response came the next day. One sentence. Our records show otherwise. No explanation, no documents, no invitation to discuss it further. That was the first time I felt uneasy. A few mornings later, I walked outside and froze. Someone had sprayed a thin orange line along the edge of my driveway. Not messy, not rushed. clean and deliberate, like a survey mark or a boundary line. It felt less like maintenance and more like a warning. My neighbor Tom leaned over the fence while I stood there staring at it. "What's that about?" he asked. When I explained, his expression changed immediately. The casual smile disappeared, replaced by something tighter. "They tried that with me last year," he said quietly. "Said part of my side yard was common space." "What happened?" I asked. He shrugged. "I backed off. Didn't want trouble." That stuck with me. Over the next couple of weeks, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Similar orange markings near other driveways. HOA notices taped to mailboxes. Conversations stopping when board members walked by. People lowering their voices when they talked about Marjorie. The emails kept coming. The language got firmer. Less clarification, more violation. Still no evidence. Still no explanation. Just repeated statements that their record superseded mine. I requested a copy of whatever survey they were using. The request went unanswered. I asked for a meeting. It was delayed. What bothered me most wasn't just the claim itself, it was the certainty behind it. The assumption that they didn't need to prove anything. That if they said it enough times, I'd eventually accept it. Standing in my driveway one evening, looking at that orange line, I realized this wasn't really about concrete or property boundaries. It was about pressure. About seeing who would push back and who would quietly step aside. And judging by Tom's response, they were used to people stepping aside. The notices escalated faster than I expected. What started as vague clarifications turned into warnings. Then the warnings became administrative fees. Then the fees turned into fines for what they now officially labeled unauthorized parking on community property. Each letter was worded a little more firmly than the last, like they were testing how far they could push before I broke. The strange part was the confidence. Every new notice sounded less like a question and more like a verdict. There was no curiosity, no room for discussion, just statements presented as fact. I formally requested a hearing. They postponed it. When it finally happened, it felt less like a meeting and more like something they needed to check off a list. I was ushered into a small room at the clubhouse and told I had a limited amount of time. Marjorie sat at the head of the table, pen in hand, tapping it lightly against her binder while I spoke. I laid everything out calmly. Photos of the driveway, copies of my closing documents, even a county plat map I'd pulled online that clearly showed the driveway inside my property line. I slid each piece of paper across the table, waiting for her to look at them. She didn't. She kept her eyes on me, nodding slowly, as if she were listening to a story she'd already decided wasn't relevant. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "This board has discretion." I asked what that meant in this situation. "It means we've exercised it," she replied. I took a breath and asked her to show me the survey they were using to justify the enforcement. Just one document, one piece of proof. She smiled, not warmly, not politely, and said, "We don't have to." The meeting ended less than 10 minutes after it began. A week later, they took the next step. I came outside one morning to find an HOA maintenance truck parked sideways across the bottom of my driveway, not blocking the street, just blocking me. A notice was taped to my mailbox stating that the driveway was temporarily restricted as a safety measure while the board reviewed ongoing violations. I stood there staring at it, stunned. My car was boxed in. There was no way out. I had to call in late to work and walk my kids to school, explaining why we were suddenly taking a longer route through the neighborhood. They asked why we couldn't use the car. I didn't have a good answer that made sense to them. I emailed the HOA immediately. No response. I left a voicemail. Nothing. The truck sat there for most of the morning before quietly disappearing, as if it had never been there at all. No explanation. No follow-up. 2 days later, the tow truck arrived. Standing there in my driveway, watching a stranger prepare to remove my car on the HOA's say-so alone, something finally clicked. This wasn't about resolving a dispute. It wasn't about correcting a misunderstanding. They weren't interested in proof because proof didn't matter to them. They were applying pressure, inconvenience, embarrassment, financial stress, all carefully calibrated to wear me down. They assumed I'd eventually decide it wasn't worth the hassle, that I'd stop parking there, that I'd accept their version of reality just to make the problem go away. And for the first time since this started, I felt something shift. Not panic, not anger, clarity. Arguing wasn't working. Explaining wasn't working. They weren't waiting for me to prove them wrong. They were waiting for me to give up. After the tow truck finally left, without my car, only because I physically stood in front of it and refused to move, I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was quiet. My hands were still shaking, but I could feel the adrenaline fading, replaced by something steadier. Up to that point, every response I'd given the HOA had been emotional. Even if I tried to sound polite, I'd been explaining, defending, reacting. And none of it had made the slightest difference. So I stopped. I didn't send another angry email. I didn't argue with the tow company. I didn't try to reason with Marjorie or the board. Instead, I picked up the phone and called the Clearbrook County Recorder's office. When the clerk answered, I asked a question that felt almost too simple after everything that had happened. Can I get a certified copy of my property survey? There was a pause on the line. I could hear papers shifting. Which one? She asked. That single question hit me harder than anything the HOA had done. Which one? I repeated. Yes, she said. We have several on file for your address. I asked her to explain. She told me that when Willow Ridge Estates was originally developed, the lots were recorded one way. Years later, long before I bought my house, an amended plat had been submitted by the HOA. That amendment redefined portions of several driveways as shared access areas. The filing had been recorded, technically making it part of the public record. What it hadn't done was notify the homeowners. No letters, no meetings, no signatures, nothing. In other words, the map had been changed quietly, and the HOA was now acting as if everyone had agreed to it. I drove down to the county office that afternoon and picked up copies of everything. Original plats, amended plats, recording dates, notes in the margins. It was all there in black and white, and the more I read, the clearer it became. The amendment didn't just affect my driveway. It affected several homes on my street alone. That's when I decided to spend the money. I hired an independent surveyor, someone with no connection to the HOA, no stake in the outcome. He walked the property with his equipment, checked historical markers, and compared the physical boundaries to the recorded documents. It took most of the day. When he finished, he walked over to me, folded his clipboard, and said, "Your driveway is 100% yours." He didn't hedge. He didn't qualify it. Always has been, he added. But that wasn't the best part. He showed me the overlay maps. The HOA's amended plat didn't just redefine access. It overlapped multiple private lots in ways that made no legal sense. Driveways. Side yards. In one case, part of a front porch. It was sloppy, overreaching, and completely unsustainable. For the first time since this started, I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't hoping I was right. I had facts that didn't depend on anyone's opinion. I thought about Tom, about the orange lines I'd seen on other driveways, about the way people went quiet when Marjorie walked by. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. And now I had something the HOA didn't expect anyone to actually go get, proof that their authority stopped exactly where the truth started. I didn't rush back to the HOA with what I'd found. That was the hardest part, doing nothing when I finally had answers. Every instinct told me to march straight into the clubhouse, drop the survey on the table, and demand they explain themselves. But I'd already learned that confrontation was exactly what they expected. Emotion made their job easier. So I waited. I started collecting everything, slowly and deliberately. I printed every email the HOA had ever sent me. I organized the notices in order, from the first clarification to the most recent fine. I took clear photos of the orange paint markings along my driveway and timestamped them. I pulled the video footage from my security camera showing the HOA maintenance truck parked sideways across my driveway, blocking me in while my kids stood on the porch watching. I didn't argue with any of it. I just documented it. I made copies of the county records, original plats, the amended plat, recording dates, notes that showed exactly when the changes had been filed and how they conflicted with earlier documents. I added the independent surveyor's report on top of everything else, highlighted and tabbed so there was no confusion about what it said. When I was done, the stack of paper was thick enough that it barely fit into a folder. That's when I started sending letters, not emails. Not messages through the HOA portal. Certified letters, sent the old-fashioned way, with tracking numbers and signatures required. One went to the HOA board. One went to the Clearbrook County Planning Office. One went to my title insurance company. And 3 went to neighbors I trusted, people I knew had quietly dealt with similar claims and backed down just to keep the peace. Each letter said essentially the same thing, that I was disputing the HOA's claim, that I had documentation to support my position, and that I was formally requesting clarification before any further enforcement action was taken. I included a specific request in the letter to the HOA. Please provide the survey or legal document used to justify enforcement against my property. I gave them a clear deadline to respond. Then I waited some more. The county acknowledged receipt. So did the title insurance company. 2 of my neighbors called me within days, their voices tense but curious. One admitted the HOA had told her the same thing about her driveway. Another said they'd been warned not to make waves. The HOA stayed silent. No email, no letter, no explanation. Instead, a new notice appeared in my mailbox. Another fine. This one referenced my continued non-compliance and warned that further action would be taken if the violation wasn't corrected immediately. That was the moment everything snapped into focus. If they had proof, they would have sent it. If they had a survey that backed them up, they would have attached it and shut me down. But they didn't. They couldn't. They were doubling down because they were running out of options. The fines weren't about enforcement anymore. They were about intimidation, about trying to scare me into backing off before anyone else started asking the same questions. And now, they weren't just dealing with one homeowner. They were dealing with a paper trail, county offices, a title insurer, and neighbors who were suddenly realizing they weren't alone. That's when I knew the balance had shifted. They weren't in control anymore. They were trying to look like they were. The next HOA meeting felt different the moment I walked in. The room was full in a way I'd never seen before. Chairs lined the walls. People stood in the back. Neighbors I barely recognized were there, holding folders tucked tightly under their arms. Some nodded at me as I passed. Others avoided eye contact, like they were nervous just being in the same room. I took a seat and waited. Marjorie opened the meeting exactly the way she always did. Calm, confident, flipping open her binder like this was just another routine night of enforcing rules. She started going through the agenda, her voice steady, almost bored. Then the door opened. A man stepped in wearing a county badge clipped to his belt, carrying a thin folder. He didn't announce himself. He didn't ask permission to speak. He walked to the back of the room and stood there with his arms crossed. Marjorie saw him. I could tell by the way her voice faltered for just a fraction of a second before she recovered. When it was time for homeowner comments, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I didn't even mention the tow truck. I said I'd like to submit documentation regarding recent enforcement actions related to driveway access. Then I walked forward and handed out copies. To the board, to the management company, and to anyone else who asked. Original plats. The amended plat, the independent survey. Photos. Notices. Dates. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavy. Not awkward. Serious. Marjorie started flipping through the pages, faster and faster, like she was hoping to find something that hadn't been there before. Her color drained as she went. She stopped tapping her pen. Someone in the third row raised a hand. "Does this mean my driveway isn't HOA property either?" No one answered right away. The county official cleared his throat. "No," he said evenly. "It never was." You could feel the shift instantly. People leaned forward. Murmurs spread across the room. Another homeowner spoke up, then another. Each question sounded more urgent than the last. Marjorie tried to regain control. She said the board would review the materials. She said enforcement was temporarily paused. She said they'd issue clarification soon. But no one was listening anymore. Because for the first time, the HOA wasn't speaking from authority. They were reacting. And everyone in that room could tell the difference. Everything unraveled faster than I expected. Within a week of that meeting, the county issued a formal correction notice. It wasn't dramatic or emotional. Just a clean, official document stating that the amended plat submitted by the HOA conflicted with earlier recorded surveys and had been improperly applied in enforcement actions. In plain terms, it said the quiet part out loud. The HOA had been treating private property like community land without the legal authority to do so. That notice changed everything. Enforcement stopped overnight. No more warnings. No more fines taped to mailboxes. The orange paint markings disappeared as quietly as they'd appeared. Homeowners started talking openly again, in driveways, on sidewalks, at the mailbox, comparing letters, dates, and experiences they'd all assumed were isolated. Then the refunds began. The HOA sent out notices informing affected homeowners that fines would be reversed and credited back to their accounts. A few days later, another letter followed, this one colder in tone, explaining that additional penalties were being assessed against the association itself for improper enforcement and failure to notify homeowners of material changes. That second letter didn't come from the HOA. It came from the county. Suddenly, the board meetings were no longer about lawn height or holiday decorations. They were about legal exposure, insurance coverage, and who had authorized what. The management company stopped returning Marjorie's calls. Homeowners started demanding answers in writing. Marjorie lasted less than 2 weeks after that meeting. She announced her resignation in an email sent late one evening, citing personal reasons and the need to focus on family. There was supposed to be a vote to remove her, but it never happened. By the time the next meeting rolled around, her chair was already empty. No speech. No apology, no explanation, just gone. The rest of the board scrambled to distance themselves. Statements were issued about miscommunication and overreach. New policies were promised. Committees were formed. The tone shifted from confidence to damage control almost overnight. Then came the tow company. I received a letter in the mail with their logo across the top. Inside was a written apology acknowledging that they'd acted on HOA instructions without verifying property ownership and confirming that my account had been flagged to prevent future action without direct legal documentation. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't defensive. It was careful. By the end of the month, the county completed a full review of the amended plat filings. Several were formally invalidated. Notices went out to homeowners confirming their original property boundaries. Title insurance companies updated records. What had started as a quiet intimidation tactic turned into a public correction that couldn't be undone. The most striking part wasn't the speed of it all. It was how quickly the authority evaporated once it was questioned. The same HOA that had spoken in absolutes weeks earlier was now choosing its words carefully, afraid of putting anything else in writing that might come back to haunt them. I never celebrated. I didn't need to. Watching the system correct itself was satisfying in a quieter way. The kind that doesn't rely on confrontation or victory laps. Just consequences unfolding, one official letter at a time. And the driveway? It stayed exactly where it had always been. Life went quiet again, almost without anyone noticing when it happened. The orange paint vanished first. One morning it was there, cutting sharp lines across concrete and grass, and a few days later it was gone, scrubbed away like it had never existed. Driveways were repainted where necessary, returned to clean edges and neutral colors. No more warning marks. No more boundaries drawn by someone who didn't own them. The HOA announced it had hired a professional management company. The language in their emails changed overnight. Everything became careful, neutral, and heavily reviewed. Words like violation and penalty were replaced with inquiry and review. Nothing happened without documentation attached. Nothing was enforced without a clear reference. Meetings became boring. Not tense, not crowded, just boring. People showed up, discussed budgets, approved maintenance schedules, and left. No raised voices, no dramatic pauses, no binders slammed shut. The kind of meetings you forget about the moment you walk out, which, I realized, was probably how they were always supposed to be. One evening, as I was rinsing off the driveway after a long day, Tom wandered over. He leaned on the fence and watched the water run toward the street for a moment before speaking. "Wish I'd fought sooner," he said. There was no bitterness in his voice, just regret. I shut off the hose and looked at him. "You still won," I said. "You just didn't know it yet." And that was the truth. The correction applied to everyone. Not just the people who spoke up. Not just the ones who had documentation ready. The county didn't redraw lines for one house at a time. They fixed the problem at the source. Every driveway, every yard, every affected property was restored to what it had always been. People started using their space again without hesitation. Kids played basketball in driveways that had been in question weeks earlier. Cars parked where they always had. The tension that had settled over the street lifted slowly, like fog burning off in the morning sun. The HOA sent out a final notice explaining the changes and thanking residents for their patience during the review process. It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. The silence that followed said more than any statement could have. What stuck with me most was how fragile authority really is when it isn't anchored to anything solid. For months, the board had operated on confidence alone, assuming no one would challenge them. The moment someone did, not loudly, not angrily, but carefully, the whole structure wobbled and then collapsed under its own weight. Life returned to normal. Not the kind of normal you celebrate, but the kind you stop noticing because it doesn't demand anything from you. And that, I realized, was the real victory. I still park in the same spot every night. Same driveway. Same stretch of concrete I've stood on 1,000 times. From the outside, nothing about it looks different. But I know better now. I know how close it came to being taken away, not because it belonged to someone else, but because someone decided they could claim it. What I learned from all of this is simple. When someone tells you they don't need proof, it's usually because they're counting on you not asking for it. Authority without documentation only works as long as no one slows down long enough to check the details. I didn't win by yelling. I didn't win by threatening lawyers or making a scene at meetings. I won by letting them put everything in writing, by keeping records, by staying calm long enough for the truth to catch up. If you're dealing with an HOA that's pushing boundaries, remember this. Paper outlasts confidence. Emails fade, claims change. But written records don't argue back, and they don't forget. Most of the time, the people overstepping aren't prepared for someone who's patient. They're prepared for anger, for fear, for quick reactions. They aren't prepared for someone who waits, documents, and lets the system do what it's supposed to do. And if you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?